Joining us now is congressional candidate for New York's 12th district, Peter Harrison. Welcome to the Damage Report.
Hey, John, how's it going?
It's going good so far. Thank you again. We really appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
There's a part of your platform, the Freedom of Movement in America plan that I want to focus on. But before we get to that, because I really do find this to be very interesting, tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to launch this campaign.
Yeah, sure. Well, John, you know this because I've been on the show a couple times as a longtime housing activist, but that's primarily been the lens that I've done my activism, whether it's in New York City or the national level. I think the affordable housing crisis is one of the most pressing problems in this country, and we need federal leadership to tackle that. But in the larger sense, I think really the 21st century has to be defined by embracing cities and making urbanism work. If we're really going to solve economic inequality, racial injustice, and climate disaster, we really have to make cities work. So that's really been the center of my campaign. Housing is a big component of it, but obviously transportation is as well.
Actually, let's talk a little bit more about housing though, because I am curious. I've just recently started to sort of think about the possibility of maybe eventually buying a house, and then I realized I'm in LA, so that's never going to happen. But I'm curious.
Yeah, fair enough.
So in the decade or so since the collapse, the last time, I know that there's a lot of fear. A lot of people like in a position like me that are very worried about the possibility that it could happen again. In terms of the way that the government, federally, state, and local, approach housing issues, do you feel like there's been much evolution, much learning in the decades since that collapse?
Short answer, no. I think you just remember that, the Great Recession was really caused by this sort of speculative bubble in the housing market, the foreclosure crisis. Millions of Americans lost their homes. That never really ended. That's kind of the thing that gets lost sometimes 10 years out, where there has been the narrative of slow but steady economic growth, is we never really solved the foreclosure crisis at the heart of the Great Recession, particularly for homeowners of color. Most of their wealth was wiped out. A number of those communities never responded or recovered. So I think just to start out, we've never solved that problem. And instead of really tackling the core issues of why this crisis happened and some of the speculation within the housing market, unfortunately, the political establishment and the Obama administration bailed out the banks. So, the idea of this happening again, it might not look the same as it did in 2007, 2008, but the same fundamental error of fetishizing homeownership and subsidizing it is still there. The federal government has not deeply solved that problem. I don't want to, scare folks like you or others that might be buying a home somewhere, outside of the fact that if we live in cities, we can't afford them to begin with. But it's not ever the case where that exact same problem is going to happen again. Yeah. But the structural stuff is there, and the homes guarantee, which I'm proud to have worked on, is really the first time that a national plan has been put together to actually address what caused that crisis.
So let's turn now to transportation. So you've got a new area of your platform around that. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, we're really excited to be the first federal campaign to introduce a plan to make all public transportation 100% free, accessible, and green. Me as a housing activist and as a lefty urbanist, prioritizing cities at the federal level is really the core of our campaign. And you really can't have deep affordability or economic mobility without making cities work. And transportation, I think, is really a core element of that. In New York City, the fares have continued to go up as the actual service on the MTA, which is the buses and the subways, has gone down. Traffic has gotten worse because of ride sharing and third-party delivery services for Amazon Prime. So we're going in the opposite direction, both from a sense of the climate disaster that we are in the precipice of is really caused by our emissions. I think it's around 30% of our global carbon emissions comes from the transportation system. So there's just no meaningful solution to climate disaster without fundamentally reorienting our transportation policy towards cities, towards mass transit, towards walking and bikes. So the freedom of movement in America really addresses that in a very honest and comprehensive way. And it's exciting because there are these conversations happening at local levels. Kansas City, Michelle Wu up in Boston's talking about this. So this is part of a larger conversation that is happening at the local level. But I do think the federal government has a massive responsibility and access to massive resources to make this plan happen.
So I'm glad the link that you made between reforming transportation and obviously the benefits in terms of confronting the climate crisis. Let's talk about economics though. Transitioning, let's say for New York, for instance, going completely fare free. How do you get to that point?
Yeah, I mean the interesting thing that's part of the conversation in New York City, which of course arguably has the best public transportation system in the country, although I think a lot of New Yorkers would scoff at that, or at least how good it is. But interestingly enough, the fares have gone up. It's $2.75 now, and it used to be a nickel. My grandfather was a motorman on the New York City subways through much of the early part of the 20th century, and it was 5 cents. And they subsidized it on purpose because the city recognized that this was an opportunity for economic mobility, social mobility. Getting people off the streets and into mass transit was just a massive economic boom. We kind of lost sight of that during the austerity era that we've been living in. But still, interestingly enough, the fares that we do get, that $2.75, it still only covers about 38% of the existing operating costs for the MTA. So even though that's a big chunk of money, that's a few $1 billion, it's still fairly manageable when you put the cost of not doing that into perspective. So the idea of just removing the fares at the buses or the subways, the cost infrastructure of managing that process, the social and racial injustice of putting millions of dollars into putting subway cops instead of actual better subway service. So, I mean, from an economic standpoint, I don't dodge that question. It's actually a boon to the economics of New York City to allow this system to have more coverage and to be free. The money that we're spending already on this system pales in comparison to the costs from traffic, the cost of bad transportation systems, and obviously the climate cost of it.
I mean, it's just a fascinating plan. If people want to find out more about it, where can they go?
Yeah, the website is www.peterfornewyork.com. I have a section specifically on the Freedom of Movement plan. We've been getting a lot of great press, a little bit nationally, certainly locally. There are some great state level candidates, some DSA members that I'm friends with are also promoting it at the state level. So there's a lot of traction for this conversation. So yeah, check out the website and please check out the plan and share it. I mean, this is something that can work obviously in a big city like New York, but should also be part of the conversation in smaller cities in this country.
Peter Harrison, thank you for joining us once again.
Appreciate it.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.